After retiring from a career in finance, Chelmsford resident Bruce Magnuson has pursued his interests in photography, art, and history. He has had his photographs in multiple shows at the Griffin Museum in Winchester and various other venues, including one featuring his infrared photographs at the Acton Library. Through the Learning and Retirement program at UMass Lowell, he has presented a wide variety of topics ranging from international affairs, social justice, photography, and the history of his home region in the Hudson River Valley. This presentation on the British painter J.M.W. Turner is a great example of the intersection of art and history, and even a little photography. So tonight is going to present Turner's Modern World. The British artist J.M.W. Turner's career spanned the tumultuous changes of Europe in the early to mid 1800s. Explore the art and times of Turner and his revolutionary ideas of painting from March 27, 2022 to July 10th, 2022. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston will be the final stop for the exhibition, Turner's Modern World. This session will provide a context of Turner and the place and his place in the pantheon of Western art, hopefully also whetting the appetite for those who may want to visit the exhibition while it is here in Boston. And Bruce has told me that he's visited and he's enjoyed this exhibition, so questions about that may be welcome as well. But thank you all so much for your patience, and thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
All right, thanks, Jess, and thanks to the Chelmsford Library for sponsoring this. She said this is my maiden voyage with the Chelmsford Library, so hopefully we don't end up like a Turner painting on the rocks. So this is Turner's Modern World, and this is my specifics on my website, my Instagram, and my Facebook. And as Jess mentioned, I've done this presentation a couple of times. This is the first time I've done it after actually having seen the exhibit. So I have included a couple of things, some pictures I took there, and also some of my impressions, because I had to kind of do this a little bit blind, not being able to see the presentation, but I did contact some folks at the MFA who did help me as I was putting this together. But I am not associated with the MFA. So this is kind of the agenda we're looking at. It is based on the themes of the exhibition. It did originate at the Tate Britain in London. And as the title says, it's Turner's Modern World. So as we see, Turner painted a lot of paintings, and this is only a subset of them. But they basically go through some themes of the home front, signs of the times, war and peace, causes and campaigns, steam and speed, modern painter, and then the one I added at the end, Turner's legacy. So let's jump into it. I promised to get you out before the NCAA basketball final happens. Let's start with some context and biography of Mr. Turner. Famous quote is, "My business is to paint what I see, not what I know is there." Go through the basics of his biography. That's a self-portrait of him there, painted around 1798, 1799. He is Joseph Mallard William Turner, in his day known as William Turner or Billy Turner. He was born 4 days after Lexington and Concord in 1775 in London, and dies in London 76 years later in 1851. He comes from humble beginnings. He grows up in Covent Garden, which at the time was kind of a working class, relatively rough area. His father's a barber, and he sells his drawings. He, being Turner, sells drawings in the window of his father's shop at a very young age. And he's featured at the age of 14 in the Royal Academy's annual exhibition. So once again, Turner he's a prodigy. I mean, there's really no other way around it. He doesn't have a lot of formal education, but he is, basically selling painting or selling drawings at the age of 14. Ironically, his father actually ends up, after his mother passes away, actually in a mental institution in the early 1800s. His father ends up being his assistant, mixing his paint, stretching his canvas, and they were extremely close. And Turner himself is a fascinating guy. One of the couple of things that are really interesting about him, he is an accomplished sailor. And as we'll see, he's also an extremely accomplished traveler, which is saying something in the time frame that he lives. So as I mentioned, he's prolific. He paints over 550 oil paintings in his lifetime, 2,000 watercolors, over 30,000 works on paper, So once again, this is not a story of Vermeer. This is not a small number of images, and it's also not a story of Van Gogh. Turner is very famous and wealthy in his time. He is noted as a can't see where that sound's coming from. We're gonna. Okay. Incredible amount of work he does. So the largest of his holdings are at the Tate Britain in London. And during his career, I mean, he knew he was famous and he wanted to leave a legacy. So one of his big things was he wanted to leave this bequest. It becomes known as a Turner bequest to the nation of Britain. And at the time, the National Gallery, the Tate are just starting. And so he ends up bequeathing over 300 oil paintings and 20,000 works of paper, which are still there today at the Tate. So they own basically over half of his work. There was quite a lot of contesting of his will when he passed away, and he didn't have any legitimate heirs, and there was a lot of back and forth, but it ended up at the Tate. And that's where a lot of the paintings in this exhibition are drawn from. And ironically enough, he was awarded the Great Silver Palette for landscape drawing while a student at the Royal Academy in 1793, and ends up being the only prize he actually ever receives. His process is pretty fascinating. Like I said, he's a pretty intrepid traveler. So as we see, he goes on these sketching trips all over the place. Mostly because of war, he's confined to the British Isles, and then there are some loosening of that during the Napoleonic Wars, and then particularly after the Napoleonic Wars, he's able to travel quite extensively in Europe. And the other kind of famous, unique thing about him is he works a lot in watercolor. And as we see, there's this hierarchy of styles within art at the time, and watercolor is kind of considered lower art, but he does a lot of revolutionary stuff. And I have a video that kind of demonstrates this, showing how his watercolor style influences his oils. And he does get a lot of his money from commissions. Once again, kind of who his benefactors are is a really interesting story of how history progresses throughout his 76 years. He starts off with the landed aristocracy as kind of his clients, and then toward the end of his career, he's dealing with businessmen as the Industrial Revolution starts to really take force. He also, like most English Brits, he wants to get a royal commission. Doesn't really end up being that successful with that, only ends up getting one royal commission. But he does do a lot of engravings and illustrations. He actually illustrates a lot of the books of Sir Walter Scott, the famous Scottish novelist. And, once again, kind of compare and contrast, when you look at something like N.C. Wyeth, who was Andrew Wyeth's father, and he was an illustrator, and it was a real problem for him that he was known as an illustrator. He wanted to be known as a fine artist. And back in the early days of the 20th century, they were kind of separate entities. But in Turner's time, he's making a living, he's doing engravings, he's doing illustrations, he's certainly a fine artist. There's no real, problem between those areas. And so he's incredibly successful. Also has his own gallery, which is unique. He's not the only one to do that, but it's not very prevalent at the time. So once again, he's marketing his own work. And as we'll see, the Royal Academy in London is a huge influence on his life, and he basically has a relationship with that his whole career, literally from the age of 14 until he passes away at 76. And as I mentioned, his sketching trips, this is just a map of some of them. And as you can see, he's kind of all over England and up into Scotland and over into Wales. He does trips over into Germany. And as we'll see, when there's a lull in the Napoleonic Wars around 1802, he's able to go to the Swiss Alps. And then after the Napoleonic Wars are over in 1815, he travels quite extensively in Europe. And Venice becomes pretty much what he's most noted for, as he travels to, I think, 3 or 4 times to Venice throughout his life. So with that, as promised, we'll take a quick video here that goes into his artistic process, particularly the overlap of watercolor with oils. Excuse me, and this was done a few years back when there was another exhibition of Turner watercolors that was shown in London.
Turner's watercolors made light and color the purpose of his work. You see all this in the stunning panorama of 16 Turner watercolours sent down to London this month on loan from the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester. Many have not been seen in the capital before. Turner often started his watercolours when a young man in the 1790s by washing the entire paper with a single hue. That single colour set a unifying mood and supplied the lighting for the whole work. Suddenly, around 1812, Turner began to apply a single underlying colour to his oils and abandoned those strong contrasts of light and dark which gave old master paintings their strength and force. Increasingly, a powerful single colour, typically golden sunlight, diffused over a whole canvas. Sometimes two contrasting colours would be underwashed, seen here in the cathedral city at Regensburg and on the rugged Alps above Chamonix. And you see the unifying colour effect too in this 1827 watercolour at Petworth, dramatically here in the same year in the colour beginning at Tivoli, and in 1845 in the moody alpine pass of St. Gothard. Without the lesson of a controlling, underlying tone that watercolours taught, Turner's oils would have stayed 18th century in feeling and very documentary in flavour. Instead, the detail with which he started slowly vanished from his work down the decades. The colour of the painting became its main purpose. Detail was suppressed to allow the triumph of light. Watercolours first, the oils later. Without the discoveries in watercolour, Turner's oils would never have achieved the drama and modernity which no other art in Europe showed at the time, and makes Turner the abiding genius of his age.
So with that, Turner, like I said, he was at the Royal Academy, and he doesn't have a lot of formal education, but he is incredibly curious. And he's hobnobbing with a lot of the great minds of the day in the early 1800s. And one of the concepts that comes out a lot when you talk about his painting is the Sublime, which is a philosophical treatise that was done by Edmund Burke in 1757, which his classic title, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. And he defines the sublime as an artistic effect productive of the strongest emotion the mind is capable of feeling. He wrote, whatever is any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror is a source of the sublime. And so this is, like I said, from the Tate's website. And in landscape, the sublime is exemplified by Turner's sea storms and his mountain scenes. So we'll get into those, and it kind of is a theme throughout the whole exhibition. And when you start looking at things in the context of the sublime, you really see where Turner's getting at, and he's a master at it. And since it is so important, we do have another video here. Promise you the whole thing's not videos, only got a couple more after this, but the sublime is pretty foundational to what Turner's doing. So this is a good explanation in about 4 minutes of what Burke is getting at in the sublime.
Normally, we hate being made to feel small. We can't stand being humbled or reminded of our insignificance. We get affronted and resentful. The 18th century Anglo-Irish philosopher Edmund Burke, however, thought that these experiences could be rather wonderful and quite important too. To explain what he meant, he developed the idea of the sublime in a beautiful book called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, first published in England in 1757. In modern use, sublime just means very, very nice, a sublime glass of Chambertin, a sublime plate of scrambled eggs with truffles. But this wasn't at all what Burke was interested in, though there is a slight connection. For Burke, a sublime experience is indeed one that's really nice, but it's nice for a very strange reason. It makes us feel insignificant. Burke was obsessed with a range of experiences, that is, sublime experiences, in which being slightly humiliated is actually something we relish. He was picking up on a sector of human experience that up to then had been totally ignored. One of his key examples is storms. The vast dark sky is oppressive, the wind is horribly powerful, large trees are overturned. We feel we're nothing in the face of the violence of nature. But this helps put things in perspective. In comparison with a storm, the familiar irritants of daily life seem less significant. Something similar happens when we contemplate a huge mountain or view the enormous frozen wilderness of the Labrador coast from the window of an Airbus A380. Burke also liked vast, momentous stories. He loved Milton's Paradise Lost, which describes the cosmic struggle between God and Satan, because stories like these also make the irksome details of ordinary life seem for a moment almost idiotically minor. Burke is latching on to a good way of being made to feel small. He's noticing that when we feel small in some ways, we become good and large in other dimensions. Bits of our egoism and pride seem less impressive. So we might be moved to be more tolerant, less wrapped up in our own concerns. Burke saw the sublime as a useful corrective. It restores perspective, and that's why we like it. It's a psychological maneuver that can benefit us in many ways and shows its utility whenever there's an excessive tendency to get caught up in the details of an immediate situation. Thanks to Edmund Burke, a little but valuable area of experience gained a name. It became possible to focus on it and see its role in life more clearly. The sublime emerged at first in connection with nature and the arts, but its contribution to existence is actually quite broad. We don't just need the sublime on holiday or in an art gallery, which are unfortunately the places we're liable to encounter it. It's something we need to build into our lives on a daily basis. In the utopia, there would be deliberate strategies to ensure we encounter the sublime on a regular basis. In the past, religions were quite careful to set up a meeting with the sublime every Sunday. After a week in the factory or the office or caught up in domestic life, everyone would be confronted with ideas of eternal grandeur, a God who loves the world so much that he sacrificed his only son for our salvation, architecture that asserted a heritage of 1,000 years, and music calculated to make us feel part of the whole of humanity. But for almost everyone, that resource is no longer available. We're collectively in need of new occasions to meet the sublime in a reliable, frequent way, so that we can be made to feel small in the most helpful way on a regular basis.
Okay, so a little bit of a diversion here. This is actually one of my photographs, but I was working on some projects back in the early days of the pandemic and continuing it, and I was drawn to these kind of concepts that I didn't really have a name for. And I was working actually with the photographer Emily Bells in a class we took last year, and the concepts were, man's kind of insignificance with nature. And so this is actually a photograph over at Dexter Drumlin, which is in Lancaster, Massachusetts, only about a half hour from Chelmsford. And I thought that this really, resonated with me, and I did not realize I was actually dealing with the sublime until I started doing the research for this presentation. So once again, it's fascinating what you learn as you go through these things, and it really was great to see that there is actually, my ignorance, that there is a whole philosophical underpinning of this, and this concept is something that has been expressed, the last couple hundred years in art. You certainly see it a lot in the Hudson River School, but you do see it in Turner. You see it so much in Turner that his first actual exhibited oil painting is as sublime as it probably gets. This is actually not in the show, but like I said, it's his first exhibit oil painting in 1796, and it basically is dealing with all the elements that Burke was talking about. And so you see right from the get-go, Turner is in this space, and you'll see right from the get-go when you go into the exhibit at the MFA, this is the first painting you see when you're actually inside the gallery. And so this is from 1805, 1806, the fall of the Rhine at Schaffhausen, which I guess, unbeknownst to me until I was aware of this painting, that is the strongest waterfall in Europe, and it's in Switzerland. And so once again, you have the way that he's doing this with the, the people are here, very, very small against nature and this rushing water. You have kind of even almost like a rainbow effect here, which, so if you go to Niagara Falls, you realize there's rainbows all over the place. But, once again, this is quintessential Sublime work, and that's what he's dealing with right from the beginning. And this is right as you get into the gallery. So we're right in that space. And another thing that Turner was a bit revolutionary about was color theory. At the time, up until this, Goethe, the great German polymath, he was everything, scientist, playwright, but he published this book, Color Theory of Perception, in German in 1810. I guess his work is actually 1,400 pages long, so there's a lot of stuff in here. But to summarize in one slide, he's getting at color, looking at it from a perceptual perspective. Up until this point, is pretty much a scientific Newtonian perspective. And you go through the prism, the white light gets broken into the different colors of the rainbow. That's what they're looking at. He gets into this, what we take for granted today, but the emotions that are associated with different colors. So he came up with all these little color wheels and pyramids and ways to kind of put color together to try to come up and articulate what emotion you're feeling. And this gets translated into English, and it's published in London in 1840. Actually, you can look at it online. It's about 500 and something pages, so I guess it's shorter than the 1,400 original. But once again, it's pretty easy to see that Turner would be exposed to this stuff, and he actually creates a painting in 1843 very specifically on this topic. This is not an exhibit, but light and color, Goethe's theory, the morning after the deluge, Moses writing the book of Genesis. And so this is toward the end of Turner's career, and you're very much into this, abstract, more modern art stuff, which obviously we'll get to in the exhibition. But, he's dealing with these ideas, very revolutionary for the time, very modern and stuff that we kind of take for granted. But, as a photographer, you look at these whole things with sunsets and all these warm colors and maybe a little bit of cool color here. He's dealing with all these things that we consider kind of foundational to the practice. And as I mentioned, this is a tumultuous time within Western European history, and Turner's right in the thick of it. We have the French Revolution is going on from 1789 to 1799, and you have, a emigration of aristocrats fleeing France for obvious reasons. They are flooding into London, and it actually affects his father's business because he was a wig maker as well as a barber, and so part of his business kind of gets undermined by wig makers from France coming in and taking away his business. You had the Napoleonic Wars, the early part of the 1800s. And as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, you have the Congress of Vienna, which is basically to divide up all of Europe after Napoleon gets vanquished at Waterloo. Although it's actually the Congress of Vienna was kind of going on when Napoleon was doing his 100 days. And as I mentioned, he's dealing with a lot of businessmen, and a lot of the businessmen he's dealing with are making their money and fortune in the slave trade, and that becomes a source for one of his most famous paintings, which we'll get into. And as I mentioned before, he is looking for a royal commission, but he actually has 4 different monarchs during his lifetime. A lot of people kind of consider him a Victorian. He's really not. He's more of a Georgian, because George III and George IV are really reigning through most of the time of his productive life. And like I say, he does a couple of paintings trying to gain royal patronage, but only gets actually 1 royal commission during his lifetime. And then we have the industrialization. As we'll see, we have the Industrial Revolution and all the upheaval that takes place in Europe being, or excuse me, England being the epicenter of that from 1760 to 1840. And a little more context around the art scene in his day. As I mentioned, he's attached to the Royal Academy. There are only 40 academicians, and he's an associate from the beginning, and there's only 40, and basically only a new one gets put in when one dies. And so he applies, I think around 24, when one passes away. He does not get accepted, but another one passes away, and at 26 he becomes a full academician. And as I mentioned before, there's kind of a hierarchy of styles you're dealing with art. Oil is considered superior to watercolor. History painting is the epitome. You have portraiture, then landscape, and then typically you have the European painting as opposed to the British painting. And the Louvre, I mean, we kind of, take the Louvre for granted, but it doesn't become a museum until part of the French Revolution in 1793, because it was a palace for the aristocracy, for the monarchy of France. And so basically the revolutionaries fill it with art from the aristocracy, and Napoleon continues to add to it as he goes on his rampage, and it becomes a source for artists. And Turner himself is able to see that. In 1802, there was a lull in the Napoleonic Wars, so he takes a trip over to Europe, and passing through France on his way to Switzerland, he does stop at the Louvre and, once again, able to see all this amazing work in one place. And, once again, something we kind of take for granted today, but that really wasn't available very much at all. The Louvre was kind of the first major museum you see in Europe. So into the exhibition. It started in London in 2020 at the Tate. So they were the source of it. It moved to the Kimball Art Museum down in Fort Worth late last year, early this year. And as just mentioned, it's now at the MFA, and it's there until July 10th. There are over 100 sketches, watercolors, and oils in the exhibit. There are some differences in the works. And as I mentioned, I didn't see the exhibit until about a week and a half ago. So I did work with the MFA a bit to say, what's in it, because I got the catalog, the published catalog was from the Tate. And I'll point out some of the differences. The majority of the images are in the MFA. There's some significant differences. The MFA actually, their most famous Turner is a slave ship, and they did not loan that to the Tate. And I guess the Tate actually used a copy of that, which seems to me a bit different. But as we go through the exhibit, I do include some of the images from a thematic perspective that are not in the show, and I'll point those out to you. And the themes are, as I mentioned, basically the agenda for this talk. We go through all the themes of the show, and this starts from the home front and ends as Modern Painter. So this is a picture I took. I went on opening day for members. It was very, very crowded. This is a picture of what the MFA is doing here. Is they're trying to replicate what basically happened at the Royal Academy. The Royal Academy would have these exhibitions. I'm not sure how many times a year they had them, at least obviously once, but all the members, would submit images, and they would be on the wall, and there would just be this, myriad of paintings on the wall. And what the MFA is giving you is kind of a sense of what that might be like. And they don't put actual paintings up here, because obviously you couldn't see them, but unfortunately, if you're an artist, you don't want to be up here. But there's always a lot of jockeying as to how your pictures got shown, kind of like shelf space on a grocery store, I guess. But these are 4 major works of Turner. We'll get into at least 3 of them, and they are huge. They are absolutely huge. So you see the folks here, you see some perspective. I mean, these are like kind of 6 to 8 feet this way and 4 to 5 feet this way. So they're very, very large. And I have to say, having looked at them as images online and then actually see them in person, it was kind of an epiphany, because it is just obviously a lot more detail, and the size just really kind of envelops you. So we will get into some more specifics, because these are fascinating images. So the sign of the times is, if you would ask me before I got into the research with this talk, is what is Turner? And I would have said a landscape artist, and that's what I kind of knew him as. And his great rival was John Constable, and this is the kind of stuff I would just associate with Turner. So it's been a fascinating epiphany for me to see just how varied an artist he was. But there are some landscapes, and does start off in this, the second theme of the exhibit, into Sign of the Times, in this landscape from Wales. But then we go right into what's going on with the industrialization of Britain in the late 1800s, at least late 1700s. And these are watercolors, but you can see they're amazing detail, color. These are lime kilns that are going on. There's this is kind of a juxtaposition of the old and the new, because you have a castle here in the background throughout all the smoke and stuff. Then you have this lime kiln, which is, for today, the new technology, new energy, new source of materials and all that stuff. And so you see he's right in this space from the get-go with what's changing the British society and the landscape. And then he's right into interior of a Canon factory. This is one of a graphite and watercolor sketch of inside of Canon factory, which once again is not your typical subject for a painter. And this is fascinating. And they have a couple of the exhibit. These are his sketchbooks, and they're about the size of a, I guess I used to call them a trade paperback. And he has, thousands of these, I believe, but he's always sketching. And there's stories of him on his trips. He his coat overturns in the Alps, and they're up to waist deep in snow, and he pulls out a sketchbook and starts sketching away. So he is just really creating all the time. He is, and said he's, for his whole career, a good, 50, 60 years of painting. He is constantly producing work, and he's using these as his baseline, and then he goes back to his studio and creates his major works. And as I mentioned, industrialization is really changing the British landscape, both culturally and physically. And you can see just basically, the population density. You have the populations moving to the urban centers here, up in the north and down by London. And you have these swaths of industrialization that is really, really changing the British landscape. And so when he's going on these sketching tours, he's seeing all this stuff, and he's certainly reacting to it. And we wouldn't be talking about Turner if we didn't also talk about the sea. And this is a early work of his of the small boats beside a man of war in 1798. And once again, you can see he has a real affinity for the sea, being a sailor himself. And we'll get to the whole man of war, and the British Navy becomes very, very integral in a lot of his work he does during the Napoleonic Wars. And speaking of which, War and Peace. This is not a portrait by Turner. You say one of Turner's probably weak points was portraits, and he didn't do that many of them, but it's hard to talk about Napoleon and not have this, the ultimate portrait of dejection. This is him after his first defeat and being banished to Elba before he comes back and does the Waterloo thing. But this is done by Paul de la Roche in 1840. So Napoleon obviously is fundamental to what's going on in Europe at the time of Turner really becoming a great artist. And so you see the reach of Napoleon. So he's going across all of Western Europe, even over into Central Europe. Obviously, he does his ill-fated march onto Moscow and retreat back from that 1812. You get the 1812 overture, you get War and Peace. If nothing else, Napoleon was certainly the source of a lot of great art. But he is really fundamental to what's going on in Europe. And obviously he's at war with Britain for most of it. So during that time, it's very difficult for Turner to travel. So he does not really go to Europe except for that one little gap in 1802 that he's able to travel. But Napoleon looms large in his work. So this is one of the works I showed you from that academy, the faux academy, if you will, that the MFA puts together to show his work, how it might have been displayed. This is the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, which for those of you who don't know, is basically the vanquishing of the French and Spanish fleets by Horatio Nelson and the British Navy to forestall a potential invasion of England by Napoleon. So when these boats come back, the story is that they just really obliterate the French and the Spanish fleets, and I don't think the British actually lose a ship, but they do get damaged, and so they come back to port on the east of England, and Turner goes down to meet them, and he wants to understand. He talks to the people who were in the battle, looks at the ships, and this is the HMS Victory, which is Nelson's flagship, and this is actually depicting because Nelson is killed during the battle. He's shot by a sniper and dies during the battle, and so this one depicts that. And you see, these. If you ever get a chance, go down to the Constitution down in Boston and the Naval Yard there. You really understand what it's like when these man of wars are whipping cannonballs at each other. It's just gruesome stuff, and they're blasting through wood and they're blasting through limbs and everything. So it's, it's up close battle, and you can really get a sense of this. And so, and also you have this depiction of Nelson's death, and you contrast that with, this is not in the show, although there is a sketch of it, I believe, the watercolor sketch. But this was his one royal commission, and this was done in 1822 for George IV, I believe. And you see it's a much different depiction of war, kind of a glorification. You have these, everything's white, and you have, it's kind of hard to see here, but in the foreground, you have kind of this, the Union Jack, and you have all these British sailors, and it's, all very kind of uplifting. And so, once again, the context of a royal commission, he's kind of playing, not kind of, he is playing to his audience. And, you can see that, and we'll see that as we get to Waterloo. But back to our friend, the Sublime. Napoleon is obviously this incredible influence as to what's going on in European history in the early 1800s. And as I mentioned, the hierarchy of art, you have kind of the history painting. So even when Turner is really not painting about Napoleon, you can argue he is painting about Napoleon, because this is a painting done in 1812 called The Snowstorm, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. So this is a famous story of the Carthaginian Hannibal as he invades Italy through the Alps. And you see once again this impending storm. You have the sun kind of bursting through. And once again, it's something great to see in person. It's a huge painting. You can't really see it here, but here there is actually a silhouette of an elephant. You can see the elephant trunk and you can see his ears. So once again, you have the people who are very, very small compared to Mother Nature and the landscape. And at the same time, you have David, the French painter, who is, if nothing else, a survivalist, because he survived the French Revolution, painted stuff that, and then ends up being kind of a painter for Napoleon. And this is his depiction of Napoleon crossing the Alps. And you have this very, very glorified picture, and the wind is blowing, he's on this white steed, and the horse is reared, and he's got all of this full regalia there and all that stuff, and a very, very muscular leg. The true story of this is actually that Napoleon crossed at the end of his army's line on a mule, but that doesn't make for a good glorification. If you want to stay in Napoleon's good graces, Jacques-Louis David is not going to paint that, but he paints this. And you see, once again, kind of a very interesting juxtaposition of what you're dealing with in a very, very similar subject of war. And so Waterloo obviously is where Napoleon meets his end. And it's interesting that Turner can't visit the Waterloo battlefield until 1816. Waterloo happens in June of 1815, but 1816 is actually the year without a summer. There's a volcanic eruption in Indonesia called Tambora, and it spews its ashes and stuff so far into the atmosphere that it affects the weather basically for a year, and 1816 is known as the year without a summer. So, people don't really know what's going on. They don't have all the, geographic and meteorological stuff that we have today. And, crops aren't doing well. There's a lot of famine. It's a tough time. So he does not go over to Waterloo, but he goes in 1817. And by 1817, you see Waterloo here is what's nowadays Belgium, has become kind of a tourist industry. And people who were either combatants or witnesses are actually giving tours of the battlefield. So he goes over there and he's getting a tour of the battlefield, talking to these folks, and once again, kind of understanding what happened. And he distills that into another one of those paintings that's on that wall at the MFA. And this is the Field of Waterloo from 1817. And I did get a zoom in on this area here, because once again, this is kind of revolutionary. Maybe we don't necessarily think about it today, but this is a depiction of from the winning side. So typically, when you're painting with winning stuff, you're glorifying. You see in the David picture from a couple of slides before, Turner's not doing that. Britain obviously wins the Battle of Waterloo, but at quite a cost. And what is actually he's depicting here is, I guess there was an entourage. The soldiers had entourages, their wives, their girlfriends would actually go along with them. So after the battle, what he's depicting is these people are basically searching the dead to try and find out if there's any of their loved ones. And he does use a Lord Byron quote from a poem saying, "Friend, foe, in one red burial blent." So once again, this is not a glorification of war, a glorification of victory. It's a very sobering depiction of it. And once again, we're into the sublime here. We have this dark, foreboding sky. We have this flare that's over, which is shedding some light on it. It's a very, very ominous picture. This is one that he painted with it. It's not at the show, I don't think. It's a watercolor. It's during the day. But once again, he's doing the same thing here with the weather and the clouds and the sky and the ominous stuff. And obviously, it's much more effective here, I think. But it was a real impact on him, and his way he depicts it is pretty fascinating in comparison to what a lot of stuff you see at that time. And then this is his most famous painting, which unfortunately is not in the show. It's called "The Fighting Temeraire, Tugged to Her Last Berth to be Broken Up," from 1839. In 2005, they had a vote in England as to what is the most favorite painting on display in England, and this one. So this literally is England's favorite painting. So I guess that's why the Tate didn't want to lend it. So it stayed with the Tate, but it does fit the theme, particularly of Napoleon, because the Temeraire is actually a ship that fought at the Battle of Trafalgar. And here we are, 35 or 34 years later, it's being broken up because this stuff is valuable. There's obviously, if you know England, there's not a lot of forest at this point in the game. Everything's been kind of cut down. So this is this interesting juxtaposition of the new and the old. You have the steamboat here, the new technology, the new transportation, tugging literally the old warhorse to its final resting place. And Turner actually did witness this scene. I guess the actual scene, going back to his original quote, I paint what I see, not what is there. There's actually were two steamboats tugging the Temeraire, but for his artistic purposes, he went down to one. But once again, as you see, when you're talking about the contrasting of colors, you have the cool blues here, you have the contrasting of the warm oranges and yellows. This is something which I've been to London. I wasn't aware of this when I went there. It's definitely something I would love to see in person. It seems like it's quite a painting. And then we'll come back to this at the end, but he does, basically go all the way through until Napoleon's exile and death. So this is a painting from 1842, and this is something that was painted in 1829 by one of Turner's contemporaries, Benjamin Robert Hayden. And it's pretty interesting because you see this is Napoleon on St. Helena. He's banished to this island in the South Atlantic, literally in the middle of nowhere. And so he's kind of, gazing out over the sea. This is the vanquished emperor, looking out over the endless sea. And once again, you do have this kind of ominous sky. Turner's after something kind of different. This is Napoleon. This is a limpet, which is basically a snail. And then you have the British soldier guarding him in the background. And then you have this blood red, colors around the pond. And, it's not a happy painting of, what was probably at the time, the greatest emperor in his day is now, reduced to this. So once again, some interesting comments. And this picture, along with another one, we'll come back to at the end because they actually do bookend as the last images that are in the show. And Napoleon today, I was over in Paris about 3 years ago. There's a very complicated relationship with Napoleon and the French, but I would just argue that you go to the Les Invalides where he's buried, and that's one heck of a tomb. And when I was there, they actually had an exhibit on Napoleon's strategy and his military thinking, obviously very with his thinking. And of course, this is a statue of him as emperor. So there's still a lot of glorification of Napoleon in France. It's a pretty interesting story. But our story moves more to the political of what goes on in Turner's day. So the next theme of the exhibition is causes and campaigns. And he paints a picture of the Northampton election in 1830. He paints the painting in 1831. And this is an election of a Lord Althorp to Parliament. And there's a lot of political upheaval going on in England at the time. And there's a lot of, political talk around reforming, who gets the vote, suffrage, all these kind of things going on. And, there's a lot of, you can tease a lot about, obviously, by the subject that Turner paints, what kind of side he falls on. So he chooses to paint the election of this great reformer who ends up being involved in the Great Reform Act of 1832, which is kind of an overhaul of the British electoral system. I think it actually reduces some of the impact of the House of Lords. It gives more representation to actual representatives to the people. They were more elected by, I think, other folks as opposed to direct population. And so it really does have a lot of change as to how the British electoral system is actually done. And then you have in 1833, the abolition of slavery, which we will get to. And obviously that's another thing that certainly the United States is dealing with at the same time. Britain gets rid of it in 1833. Obviously we have to go through the Civil War to do that. And you have this happening in 1834, the Houses of Parliament burn. And they were wooden. It's hard to believe that the actual houses there today, the very Gothic looking structures, were only from the mid 1800s. They actually aren't that old. But this burns, this huge fire happens. And once again, he witnesses it. He's there in London and he goes out in a rowboat, I guess, and actually sketches it. And, he paints a couple of paintings of this thing, which obviously is an incredibly dramatic event. And so this is one in the show. And it is kind of this, classic the time frame is just amazing. Is you had these huge political repercussions happening in the Great Reform Act of 1832, and then you literally have Houses of Parliament and Lords burned to the ground in 1834. So there's no more direct metaphor of the New England coming up when the Houses of Parliament are built in the Gothic style in the mid 1800s. And we get to the slave ship, which this is one of his most famous images. It is in the permanent collection of the MFA. It is what they use to advertise this. It was my title slide had this. The official name is Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. Some of Turner's, this is actually one of his shorter titles. Some of his titles are just unbelievable. They go on for like paragraphs. But this one is based on a poem, which is based on a real incident. But the story is that as a ship, you don't get insurance if your slaves die on board. If they are lost overboard, you can file an insurance claim as lost cargo. So this depicts, it was something happened in the 1780s, I believe, that a ship had this happen and they were throwing people overboard. And once again, it's a pretty interesting painting in the fact you have a lot going on here and you have a lot of emotions that are kind of being tugged at. And the fact you have this, classic Turner sunset and these, bucolic, golden hour rays, as we call them in photography. And then you kind of have going into this dark, ominous typhoon. And then in the front, and I got this close up of it, and this is where you really start getting this, really see what's going on. And these are all these bodies floundering. And you have, body parts around, you have people in manacles, you have this fish that's like steaming along to presumably, eat people, very horrific scene. And, once again, you can certainly tease out what his view is. One of the ironies is in 1805, he actually invested in a slave operation. It was like I think it was raising cows in Jamaica that was being raised by slave labor. And he invests about, I think, 100 pounds and ends up losing everything. And so obviously 35 years later, he has a different view on it as to what's going on. And it's just about 7 years after the British abolished slavery. But obviously it's still prevalent in the world. And this is one of the centerpieces of the show. One little tip I'll give you is they have a 6-minute video on this that is actually in the gallery. It's also on their website. I would suggest if you really are interested in it, watch the video on the website before you go, because the gallery, it's pretty cramped. It's a 6-minute video. It doesn't run. I think it runs like once every, 10 or 15 minutes. So at least when we were there, it was pretty crowded around it. You had to stand and wait for the video to start and to watch a 6-minute video. So I would suggest you watch the video online first, and then you can enjoy the painting in its fullest. And there are some pretty interesting images around it that it's great if you can kind of maneuver around the crowd and, look at the images and not have to be standing there waiting for the video to start. And quickly, the transatlantic slave trade from the 1400s to the 1800s is a big economic deal. And, a lot of the Western Europe powers are involved in it. And, it does go all the way, obviously, from Africa. You have influences both in South America, a lot in the Caribbean. Obviously, you have it both here in the British colonies, the third, what became the United States, but also New France, which up here in Canada and what was the northwestern areas, it was very integral to the economy of what's going on in Europe. And like I said, some of his benefactors make their fortune in the slave trade. And, his depiction of that is really a monumental work that is considered one of his great masterworks. So Steam and Speed goes into the technological changes that he's seeing. And so, once again, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. All these technologies are, coming to the fore, things that we take for granted. And, once again, everybody thinks that the age they live in is the most advanced and the most rapid change and everything. And, there's a lot going on here in the 1800s. And he's depicting it, which is kind of radical, as we'll see in one image that, critics are after him as to why would you depict this? And, it's going on and it's real. And so this is Kielman heaving the coal in coals by moonlight. And, you have these coals that are being put on ships in a river, and you have this moon, full moon, casting light onto the waters of the harbor. You have his classic juxtaposition of the cool and the warm. You have the blues over here and the whites, and over here you have the reds and the oranges and the yellows, and then you kind of have the blending of this as the image goes from here to there. And so, he's really depicting this industrial changes that are going, and these soon to be kind of vanquished sail ships are transporting coal that's going to be fueling the trains and the steamers. And speaking of which, this is a steamer, which is, I guess it's off an unpopulated island off the coast of Ireland. And, he's depicting this fascinating kind of, merging of man-made and nature, where the steam is kind of blending into the sky. And, once again, very ominous overtones, very sublime. His great rival was Constable, and Constable had a lot of respect for Turner. I don't think it went the other way, but Constable did say, Turner paints with steam, and you see this here. It's just really the merging of the steam from the boat with the ocean and its uproar going on, and then you still, of course, have the little sun here to give you a little bit of hope. He gets into the space with the steam and the pollution, quite frankly, of what you're dealing with in London in the industrial age. And this is water, the Thames River from Waterloo Bridge. And, you really can't see that much. And you have all of this, back at that time, the industrial factories are really right along the Thames in London, and they're spewing all this stuff, and the coal smoke and all that is really merging together. And, once again, from an artist perspective, is fascinating atmosphere. From a health perspective, not so much, but it is pretty interesting that he's, depicting this as it is in 1835, 200 years ago. We had all this stuff going on. And here is kind of a merging of the two. It's rockets and blue lights close at hand to warm steamboats of shoal water. So this is a depiction of, basically, I guess in lieu of a lighthouse, they set up these flares during a storm to let the ships know that there's shoals there that they could wreck themselves against. And you have people here on the beach and the shore, anxiously looking at what's going on, and, are these ships going to wreck? And, once again, you have the blue here and the contrast with the warm where the people are, and this kind of emerging of kind of a warm, the good feeling per se, and then here the kind of cold, and this is what's going on. This is pretty harsh stuff, and the sea is not forgiving, and you have the man trying to match up against it with its technology. And then one of his more famous ones, the snowstorm steamboat off a harbor's mouth. This one is just really, this is 1842, so you're really into his, lack of a better term, abstract phase of his career, and you just have this vortex of the boat and the steam merging with the water and the sky. It's all just kind of one. And I don't think you can read this, but this is in the show, and the description of it, he tells a story that he straps himself to a mast of a ship during a storm, not knowing if he's going to survive, and is able to experience this and then able to relate it in the painting. Great story. And I guess he wasn't the first one to tell it, but this one gets into the fact that the boat that ship that he quotes that he's on, and where he leaves from, what port he leaves from, it doesn't add up. There's no ship that name and that left from that port. And so the scholar's view is it didn't actually happen, but it is a heck of a story. And however he did it, he was able to capture this really intense merging of, the steam, the ship, the sky, the ocean, all in this swirling vortex, and it's very evocative. And this one, unfortunately, is not in the show, but it is one of his more famous paintings. And this is the one where the art critics really started to get after him. It's called Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway, 1844. They're like, why are you painting a picture of a train? Like, that's not a appropriate subject matter for a fine artist. But obviously this is, foundationally changing how you travel. His travels by coach and stuff like that become much different when you have a train. And it's interesting, it's hard to see in this one, but this is open air. And I guess at this time, this is the early days of the locomotive, but kind of like steerage on the ships, the people who are in the literally cheap seats are here with no covering, and they're standing. They're actually not even seats in the cheap seats. So they're going about 50 to 60 miles an hour. But I guess compared to not being able to go at all or riding a stagecoach over rutted roads, this is probably a better deal. But he does say rain, so these people are getting wet, so they're going through the rain, over this railroad bridge. Pretty fascinating painting. And that'll take us now to the modern painter, which is really, where Turner becomes, the critics don't like him so much, and it's a really fascinating end to his career. It's what he's dealing with from technique as well as subject matter. As I mentioned with his travels, he does go to Venice quite a bit. I think like a third of his paintings, excuse me, in this period are from Venice. So he doesn't spend there that long. He's only there for like a couple of weeks at a time, but he really does get a bond with Venice. And Venice is kind of on the downslope, I guess. It used to be part of the a very, very obviously huge mercantile port, and becomes part of the Austria-Hungary Empire, and kind of gets put to a backwater, pardon the pun. And it's kind of gone past its glory days. And so obviously with the fact that there's a lot of water going on, salt water going on here and everything else, these things start to show their age very quickly. But he really bonds with it, and spends a lot of time there in his later years and creates some very interesting images. This, my wife and I were at the National Gallery in DC back in November. And so I was researching this and said, oh, where are there Turners? And we go to the National Gallery, and obviously the curator knows what they're doing, but this is a Venice image, which actually is in the show at the MFA. It's Venice from 1834. And then you have Venice 10 years later, 1844. So really hard to come up with a better juxtaposition of the evolution or de-evolution, depending upon your view, of Turner's style. And just within a 10-year period, how he has this, almost a quasi Canaletto type of detail to it. And then here we have this very, very, impressionistic, for lack of a better term, depiction of it. It's fascinating. And he also, this one has been referenced a lot, the artist Mark Rothko, with his color blocks and stuff like that. We'll get into him a little bit with a video. But these are, once again, depictions in more of a modernistic style. And he's also talking, once again, about, current economic things that are going on. Whaling is a huge thing, and it's a huge business. Obviously, it's incredibly influential in New England, and this is 1845 with the height of whaling. Whaling's kind of sweet spot actually isn't that long. It's amazing all the art and literature that came out of that, but he's depicting this, and I think there's like 3 images of whaling in the Modern Painter Gallery, which is the last gallery at the show, and it's pretty fascinating. And this one is not in the show, but it is kind of an archetype of what we're talking about with regard to Turner's final phase of his career. And there was a video done by the Tate, and they had another show, I think it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, about late Turner. And they go into some depth about what's going on here and then some of the possible downstream influences. So we will take a quick look at this video.
Tate Britain's new exhibition, Late Turner, is devoted to the final phase of Turner's career. It begins in 1835 when he turned 60, and it ends in 1850 when he exhibited for the last time at the Royal Academy, just a year before his death. And it's big. There are 180 works in the show, but I want to talk about just one, and it's this painting here, Norham Castle Sunrise. Now, Norham Castle, south of Berwick in Northumberland, it was very important for Turner. He depicted it several times during his career, and it was so important for him that the final time he visited it in 1831, he actually bowed to the castle as though in respect. But this dates from a little later, around about 1845, and it's often taken as an archetypal work when people think about late Turner, the style of his final years, because by then his paint has become very free, very loose. The actual forms and details seem to have dissolved in light. So what you see here is this silhouetted blue castle, which is very pale blue. It's quite ghostly, as though it's dissolving before our eyes. Behind it, you've got this great fireball of yellow, the sun rising up, so that the canvas feels like it's glowing. Light is coming out at us. And then in the foreground, this detail I love, this cow in some umber tones with a sort of reflection beneath, which gives the whole piece a very impalpable, insubstantial, airy, fantastical quality. It's though this could be watery rather than level ground. And the distinction between the sort of horizon line and where the sky begins is blurred. Everything's blurred and indistinct. It gives it a very hazy, poetical, really quite beautiful quality. But part of the point of this exhibition is to make us interrogate how we've come to understand works like this. Because in the 20th century, people looked at Norham Castle Sunrise and said, aha, Turner, he is the forerunner of modern art. Out of paintings like this, you can see impressionism, you can see abstraction. But the curators of the show at the Tate want us to think again, because you know what, this could actually just not be finished. It is quite experimental, and ultimately it's probably anachronistic to start casting onto Turner future art movements that he knew absolutely nothing about. At the same time, it does always make me think of this wonderful anecdote about Mark Rothko. He saw some works by Turner, the final works of his career, in a show in New York in 1966. And afterwards, supposedly, he said, that Turner, he learnt a lot from me.
So this is the end of the exhibition. These two paintings basically are on each side of the doorway as you exit the exhibition. And we have seen this before. War, exile, and the rock limpet. When I show people say, what's a limpet? Well, this is actually what a limpet is. It's a little snail type thing. And he did these both in 1842. And this is Peace Burial at Sea. Once again, juxtapose the color palette here, very warm, a little bit of blue here, but still very, very warm, blood red warm. And here, very, very austere. And so this is basically a depiction of his friend and rival, the painter David Wilkie, who dies of typhoid on the way back from a trip, and he's near the island of Gibraltar. And the head of Gibraltar, the mayor, whoever's the head of Gibraltar, won't let him on, won't let the body on because it's typhoid, and they're concerned about infection. So he's buried at sea. But some art historians have said, if you look closely at it, there's actually a casket here. And they argue that you don't bury people at sea in a casket. And they think that he may have actually been painting the I think it was 1841 or maybe 1842. They bring back Napoleon's body to France. So that whole thing I showed you, the Les Invalides and all that, he dies like 1825 in St. Helena, but he's not actually brought back to France until the early 1840s. And so they think that he kind of, he being Turner, did kind of a right turn and was going to paint this, basically funereal image of Napoleon coming back to France. And when his friend passes away, he basically changes over to this. But either way, it's a very evocative image. And as that 1842, the MFA has those at each side of the door as you exit. And I will say that you do not exit into a gift shop, which is a little bit surprised at. Most of these exhibits, at the end, they throw you right into a gift shop. And I couldn't find actually a lot of Turner merchandise in the MFA, but it was kind of interesting. This is what they used to end the exhibit. And Turner himself, he does pass away in 1851, and to kind of bookend his life, you have in 1851 the great exhibition in London at the Crystal Palace, which is built on Hyde Park, and is this huge edifice, which is how you get the Crystal Palace soccer team. It burns in 1930, so it's not there except in Disney World they have a Crystal Palace. But you had this, really, monument to modernism, which happens, and Turner's very interested in this, and he does visit Hyde Park during the last year of his life to see this being constructed. So you had this kind of nice metaphor at the end of his life, this, prototypical modern painter as the modern age is really being ushered in by this exhibition, this building in London. And this is 90% sure the only photograph of Turner toward the end of his life. And once again, he was interested in technology, and there was a photography studio in London that he would frequent and would ask the photographer a lot of questions. He didn't do photographs himself, but he was very interested in the science and the actual creation of early photographs in the 1840s. And this may be an apocryphal story, but supposedly his last words, Turner's last words, were, "The sun is God." So where does that leave us with Turner and his legacy? This is a still from the movie Mr. Turner that was done by Mike Lee back in 2014. And if you get a chance, it's really well done. I don't know the actor's name, I forget his name, but he plays Turner, and it's a fascinating depiction. It's a pretty high budget movie, so it's really interesting as to, as far as I could tell, like 95% of what they depicted was actually true. But I was looking for some local connections, and the artist Fitzhenry Lane out of Gloucester is a Illusionist maritime painter. Some of you may be familiar with him. They have works of his at the MFA. They have I think the largest of his collections at the Cape Ann Museum up in Gloucester. And I'm no art historian, but I was just like, this looks similar time frame. A lot of the space that they're doing in and working in, it just seems like maybe there's some connection. So this is a statue actually that was done in 1997 of Fitzhenry Lane. This is his house actually, which is right on the harbor in Gloucester. And his name was erroneously thought to be Fitzhugh Lane. Turns out it was actually Fitzhenry Lane. And there's not a lot known about a lot of his early life, but he painted images like this. And the time frame is 1855, 53, 54. And just looking at these, saying, particularly this one, you're like, okay, there's got to be some sort of connection with Turner. This is just a very similar space we're working in. So I reached out to the Cape Ann Museum and, just said, hey, is there any documentation that there's any kind of connection between Fitzhenry Lane and Turner? And they were very gracious, and they sent me a scholarly article that somebody had written where there was an overlap with this luminous painter named Robert Salmon, who did paint in England in the early 1800s, did show at the Royal Academy with Turner, and then emigrates to the United States and ends up working in a lithography studio in Boston with Fitzhenry Lane. And Robert Salmon becomes this kind of, I guess, father of luminous painting. Of which Fitzhenry is probably the most noted. And so like I said, there's not a lot of documentation about Fitzhenry Lane in general, particularly in his early years, but there certainly was some overlap as influences, and they're both working in this Boston studio in the 1830s, I think 1830s or 1840s. So the researcher said it was reasonable to assume that there was obviously some transfer of knowledge. And once again, in those days, it was hard, particularly from Europe over to America, to actually see these paintings. You see stuff like when the Hudson River School, guys like Frederick Church and Albert Bierstadt, when they do their images, they go on tour, and you go pay to see an image. It's quite a big deal, but that's all domestic. And so this kind of cross-pollination of seeing works and stuff like that we take for granted today wasn't happening. But it's reasonable to assume that there was some influence of Turner in this in Lane's paintings. Definitely there's influence of Turner as you see Monet. I mean, he does a lot with steam, or with fog, as they call it, which really is pollution, in London. And so he goes on a number of trips and stays in a hotel and creates a number of images of the River Thames and the Waterloo Bridge, which is specifically the scene that Turner had depicted about 50 years earlier. So he's working in the same space. And you see a similar thing with our friend Whistler. This is a famous painting of his, Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket in 1875. Very abstract, the color palette very blue. Whistler is a fascinating guy, and he has maybe one of the best artistic quotes of all time. I shall be born when and where I want, and I do not choose to be born in Lowell. He was quite the character. Great artist, I guess not so great a person, but if nothing else sums up what James Whistler was like, this probably does it. But he, actually, at one time he was saying he was born in St. Petersburg because he was just trying to create his own narrative, and it's fascinating. But you can certainly see Turner influences in that. And up to the present day, February of 2020, the UK actually issues a £20 note with Mr. Turner and his self-portrait, as well as the Fighting Temeraire in the background. And interesting story about this, this is an image from the web, and I imported it into Photoshop to try and cut out this part here and just clean it up a bit, and Photoshop would not let me import it because he said it was an image of currency, and Photoshop will not let you do that. So I had no idea that was the case, and my career as a counterfeiter was nipped in the bud, but I thought that was kind of interesting. But he is the national hero, the artistic national hero of Britain, and they're still memorializing him today. And maybe the most important way is the Turner Prize, which is given each year to a cutting edge artist. So you do kind of have that coming together of, Turner was breaking barriers, even though he came from within the establishment of the Royal Academy. He's kind of a fascinating character in the fact that he actually, does these revolutionary things, but also within the context of the establishment. So the Turner Prize is given out every year to cutting edge modern artists, which is probably a great legacy for Turner. And I'll end with a quote by his friend, John Ruskin, and critic. Everything in the sunshine and the sky so talks of him. Their great witness is lost. So as I said, my sources, a number of books. The Leon Doucette was the gentleman curatorial assistant from Cape Ann who helped me out with the Fitzhenry Lane stuff. Kara Wolahan from the MFA was very instrumental in helping me at the beginning, trying to understand what images were going to be in the show, as opposed to the ones that were not going to travel from the Tate. And it was fascinating when you go to galleries and say, let's try and find what Turners are in the galleries. The bulk of the stuff is in England, but there are images throughout museums in the United States, and you can do worse than go in and look for a Turner. And the exhibit is up, like we said, until July 10th. It does require, if you're not a member, it does require an additional timed ticket. I think it's $7 above the admission price for the MFA, but they are doing time tickets. They're not doing time tickets for the entry to the MFA anymore, but for the Turner exhibit, they require time tickets. And never want to shy away from self-promotion, but I do have a photograph at a Griffin exhibit in Downtown Crossing. They have a gallery called the Downtown Crossing Gallery, which is in the Lafayette building, kind of behind Macy's. And they have shows there every 3 months or so, and they do different themes. And the current one is color theory. If you look really closely, that's mine. But if you're down in the downtown Boston area sometime, check it out. And that's the presentation. So I'd love to hear any questions or comments. I see stuff in the chat here that I haven't been able to really pay that much attention to, but I don't know the photo establishment that he frequented. If we go back, this book here, The Extraordinary Life and Momentous Times of J.M.W. Turner by Franny Moyle, she talks about that at the end of the book. So it's a pretty recent book, and that could give you that. What else do we have? Well, thank you. I'm better than the MFA. I did watch the MFA's program as well. They did a pretty good job. I mean, they read their stuff. It was written by a curator, obviously. There was a couple of things in there I didn't know, but I said I kind of, I played fast and loose to a certain degree with the actual contents of the exhibit, because once you get into Turner, and I say he painted, 550 oil paintings, so there's a lot of stuff there. When you start looking at themes, particularly when I was going into the space of Napoleon, there are things that just seem to make a good story that don't follow necessarily the exact exhibition that you're seeing. But so I took a few liberties with that. So the MFA people probably can't do that. But the MFA, it's weird. There is the Kimball Museum. There are some videos online from the Kimball. They actually have an interview with the two curators from the Tate who put this show together. And for those of you who are MFA fanboys, George Shackelford, who used to be a curator at the MFA back in the 90s and responsible for a lot of the Monet blockbusters that we had, he's now at the Kimball. And they did a couple of videos with him, and they actually have a video, I think, with you can walk through virtually the exhibit. The MFA hasn't done a lot. I don't really know what's going on. They didn't do much Zoom, if any Zoom, during the pandemic. So I don't know exactly, but if there's anybody from the MFA who wants me to do work for them, I'm certainly available.
Bruce,
Yes.
you recorded all of this. Is it possible to get the recording? Since I missed the first part because I didn't understand the symbol or where to go.
That's a question for Jess. We are recording, I think.
Yes, we are recording, and I will send that out to everyone who's registered. And
Okay, great.
again, I apologize for the problems in the beginning. But great presentation.
It was excellent, Bruce. Really loved it.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments folks want to have?
If anyone else has any questions, they can unmute themselves and go ahead and ask. We'll wait like about 5 more minutes, maybe.
Was Turner considered a illusionist?
I haven't heard that term. No, I mean he's considered a romantic.
Okay.
But I mean he really gets the end of his career. The critics, they think he's losing his sight. Is the first thing. All these blurry paintings are coming out, and then the first thing is he's losing his sight, or is he losing his mind? So this John Ruskin, who I had the last quote on, he becomes a pretty big influence in establishing the reputation of Turner. I mean, one thing I can say is if you want to be a famous painter after you die, have somebody write your biography really quickly after you die and make it good. Because you see that with Vasari, the lives of the painters of the Renaissance. He writes this biographies of Raphael, I think, Michelangelo, all these people, and they become the basis for everything going forward. And then some scholars come back and say, that's not all true. So Ruskin is a huge, huge fan of Turner. And he's a well-respected critic. His father is, I think, a very wealthy aristocrat. So he has a lot of influence. And he writes a book in the, I think, 1860s that is around artists, including Turner. And he's responsible a lot for establishing Turner's reputation going forward. But like I said, Turner had a pretty big view of himself, and he had this Turner bequest. He wanted a gallery dedicated to him. One of the stipulations for giving the bequest was that it had to have a gallery dedicated to him. So I mean, he had an ego, you can say justified, but he was not a shrinking violet.
The movie wasn't very flattering, the movie of Turner.
Well, it's funny because my wife watched it and she wasn't immersed in it like I was, and he grunts a lot. But I had just finished one of the biographies, and I thought it was good. I liked, yeah, he was a curmudgeon. I mean, some of the critics do say it, overly emphasized that. The truth of the matter is, it's 150, 200 years ago. His correspondence, I would have liked to go back and read it, but from what I understood, it's hard to get by. He was a horrible poet and always wanted to attach some of his verse to his work. So the impressions of somebody from 200 years ago, it's hard to say. And he was an instructor at the Royal Academy, and he was notorious for not being very articulate. But when he did perspective. He taught perspective, but when he did, he'd be like this kind of babbling, incoherent, and then these brilliant things would come out, and people were like, that just justifies it. So, I mean, there's no doubt he was a complicated guy. He came from very, very, not the typical upbringing that you're going to have to be an artist. So, yeah, obviously you bring your own perceptions when you look at something like that. And I saw it, and they didn't really, they relatively accurately depicted what 1830s London might have been like. And 1830s London was not a pretty place. And you got horses, and you got all the pollution, all the tenements, all the factories going on. It's obviously just read Charles Dickens, but so it's not, and to our sensibilities, like, ooh. And they didn't shy away from that. Everybody doesn't have all their teeth. Turner at the end of his life has no teeth and has to suck his food. I mean, so I think he depicted, maybe you could argue because other people haven't depicted it like that, which is more real. Mike Leigh, who's the director, it really is kind of shocking in comparison, but I thought it was fascinating. And I thought it was really, there's only one particular situation that seemed like it really didn't happen. Other than that, for a 2-hour movie to encapsulate a guy who painted 550 paintings and make it, dramatically interesting, I thought it was pretty well done. So I'll be doing a presentation on movie criticism later on.